Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Maybe some people are taking a longer Easter break than we give you anyway. We will not meet again until Tuesday, right? We don't have any class on Thursdays or Fridays this week because of the Easter holiday, nor do we have classes next Monday. But remember that Tuesday, your Monday classes meet on the Monday schedule, all of them, and none of your Tuesday classes meet on Tuesday, right? So next time I will see you will be just over a week from now. We left off talking about Romanticism, which is this other Enlightenment art movement. They're both really interested in the freedom of the individual or our place in society, but the Romantics are much more interested in sort of a darker side of things. Those places where we humans are utterly free, and sometimes that's irrational, that freedom. Whereas, of course, neoclassicism is a very rational movement. And so what we see with Romantic artists are an interest in themes where we kind of lose it, right? Where we stop being bound by the norms of society on a certain level. Sardanapalus, for example, on the left, a king who decides to slaughter his entire harem in the 7th century BC rather than let his enemies have it as they attack his palace. His servants hauling in horses, elephants, and of course his many harem women to be killed at his whim. Jericho's newsworthy scene, the raft of the Medusa, an event from only a few years earlier, where the people are struggling their best to survive in a harsh environment and turning to very irrational acts, infighting, mutiny, even cannibalism, as they struggle to survive, surviving at all costs. These are very dark images. They're not particularly easy to look at sometimes, even. But they're sort of an important element of what's developing in art in France during this time period. The other thing that we're seeing with these two artists is a growing interest in sort of social consciousness, social responsibility. Jericho sees this news event, as many people in France did, as a criticism of the Restoration monarchs, the kings who had been put back on the throne after the fall of Napoleon in 1815. Delacroix using this ancient history also as a veiled criticism of the French king, out of touch with his people, greedy, using his power for nefarious means. These two artists and Romanticism in general, actually neoclassicism as well. I think the thing that the Enlightenment brought to art is an idea of an understanding that your actions, your activities have an impact on the world around you and can have a positive impact if you do it right, if you take it that way, right? The other thing that the raft of the Medusa shows us is this other very romantic interest in the power of nature. Remember that Romanticism is based on that, really kind of centers on that line from Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that mankind longs to be free, but everywhere is in chains. And nature was seen as this ideal, unfettered. Man cannot conquer nature. And that became a very, very strong theme through the Industrial Revolution, where, of course, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is conquer nature, bring it under our control. And what we find are a number of images wherein that's a physical impossibility. There's just no way. And so here we are in England with Turner, J.M.W. Turner, really one of the great English artists, period, alone just within landscape. And we have quite a few Turners in the National Gallery, so we're going to stick with them mostly, although I'll show you one from Boston as well. But both of these images deal with this idea of our struggle against the power of nature, which can destroy all that man attempts to do. The Raft of the Medusa obviously ties directly into that theme, given that it's a shipwreck image, right? That's obviously the nature destroying the works of man But Jericho also emphasizes that a bit by not only sort of piling up the dead and the dying in the foreground, which is so romantic, but the waves that crash over the edge of the boat, almost taller than the sail itself, obscuring their attempts to be rescued. Right? Nature is stronger than we are. We're helpless out here. For Turner, on the left, at the junction of the Thames and Medway, this is where the Thames River, after it flows out of London, flows into the North Sea, right? Or the English Channel, depending how you call it, right? And so it's the bar where that current of the river meets the tide, right? And if the tide is going out, it's one thing, but if the tide is coming back in, that's a different thing altogether. The bar of any river, it can be very, very difficult to cross. I don't think the Potomac has that problem because it empties into a bay and the tide is not as strong there, right, where it empties out. But I grew up in the Northwest. I grew up in Portland, and the Columbia River bar is extraordinary. I mean, it's that way all the time. People die every year trying to cross the bar and where the Columbia empties into the Pacific. And it gets worse when the tide's coming in. It gets even worse than that in a storm, right? And that's what Turner chooses to depict for us, is that very, very difficult crossing of where it's called the bar, right? And at the moment of an approaching storm. So it really is about the strength of weather, the strength of nature, and our attempts at harnessing it through sailboats, and the fact that here we are out on the water anyway, and how futile or dangerous those attempts can be. Right? This is, again, a very romantic theme, because nature is the ideal that is not controllable, right? Mankind longs to be free, but we control ourselves, right? We have all these chains that we put upon ourselves. But nature is utterly free, right? And Turner really focuses on that through the vast majority of his pictures. He's primarily a landscape painter. One of his most famous works up in Boston is The Slave Ship, and it depicts a historical scene from the original scenes from the 1780s, late 1780s. Here, toward the end of his career, his paintings get significantly more abstract. And what happens with Turner is he sort of moves from trying to capture how nature looks in our picture on the left to how nature feels in the picture on our right. So rather than show the appearance of nature, he's trying to use his paint to capture the forces of nature and replicate that. And what it means is that the pictures become increasingly abstract as he pushes the paint around, thinking of the paint as representing forces rather than appearances, right? And as you look at the sky, you realize that it's a terrific stormy sky, right, with the sun cracking through it. And he loves these images of looking directly into the sun, right? And how the storm is gathering and really bursting and left with all those colors. And then off to the right, we see the clouds breaking up and the blue sky cracking through, right? And this ship moving right directly into the heart of the storm, right? But as we look at the picture close up, it really ends up looking like a 1950s abstract picture. It's just utterly sort of pushing the paint around and not trying to define anything. So the sun itself doesn't even become a circle anymore. But the forces of the sun spilling out from that, pushing away, right? Pushing through the mist and the clouds, right? And flecks of red and yellow picked up around that. Because again, he's not as much interested in representation as he's about capturing the forces of nature. That's such a romantic outlook, right? And Turner was known to read the weather reports. He lived in London, painted all of these things in the studio in London, right? He didn't paint in the outdoors. Nobody did yet, right? But he would read the weather reports, and he'd find out where the storms were in England, and he would book a train ticket and ride into the heart of the storm And it sounds kind of like a dog or like the Joker in The Dark Knight. When they hit the storm, he'd stick his head out the window just so he could feel the force of nature on his face, right? And this was sort of one of his little things we do. And he'd then take that experience and try to capture it in paint. That idea of barreling into the heart of a powerful storm. And I think he very much captures that with the slave ship, right? And in this case, what he shows us is a sort of horrific scene. The slave ship itself has actually steered into a storm, just as Turner himself would take a train into the heart of a storm. And the story behind this is that it's a true news story. It broke, and it was a horrifying news story. The owner of the ship was transporting slaves from Africa to Jamaica, and it was standard practice to take out insurance policies because the humans in the hold are considered property, right? So you take out insurance for the property, which is to a 21st century audience just horrific itself, right? And the norm was to take out insurance against storms, against natural events that could get in the way of the transatlantic journey, right? And so the captain of this boat had insurance against storms. But there was a cholera outbreak in the hold, and he didn't have insurance for illness. So what he did was he saw off the horizon there's a storm coming. He steers his boat toward the storm. And as he hits the storm, he throws the slaves overboard so he can claim insurance. Right? It's just a horrifying scene. And again, we've seen that the Romantics don't tend to shy away from horrifying scenes. Inhumanity, irrationality, right? And so we see the moment that the boat hits the storm, which, by the way, abates, and the ship isn't destroyed, and he rolls into Jamaica Harbor with an empty hold and has to explain for himself, and he's arrested. And in fact, it was a major event leading to Britain banning slavery because it was an inhumane practice, right? It's a huge step that way. When Turner paints this in 1839, they've taken further steps. They've legalized it. They've also said that it's considered piracy and that they can then arrest other countries who were doing it as well. The Brits were way ahead of us this way, right? And this was a major event, okay? So what we see right down in the foreground is the aftermath of this horror, right? Hands with chains sinking into the waves. And again, it becomes almost difficult to see because of the way Turner paints, right? He's trying to, again, capture force rather than illustration, if you will, appearance. But we still see down in the foreground hands coming out of the ocean, scavengers coming to peck at the flesh, right, as they die. And in the right-hand corner, more leg coming out with shackles on it, and these huge fish coming around, a shark fin and various other kinds of grub-eating fish coming to feed on the bodies. That makes it even that much more horrifying, right? So again, as a romantic picture, this is very much focusing on a new theme for us, but some old ones as well. The old themes being, of course, our ability to act irrationally as humans, right? The darker side of human nature is an ongoing romantic theme. But at the same time, it brings in this new theme of the power of nature, which we began to see with Géricault, but we see much more strongly with Turner. Right? Another way to approach the power of nature is to depict nature not so much wild and crazy like Turner does, but to depict nature as something that can't be changed by mankind. Something that remains unspoiled by human activity. And another British landscapist, John Constable, focuses on that approach to nature, right? The power of nature as seen through its ability to resist change. And this is the era. Constable, like Turner, is in London. Constable, like Turner, is painting landscapes in the studio. Right? And he chooses a scene near where he grew up. Right? Essex County, I think, is where it is. The Stour River in Essex County. And he keeps going back there to make drawings and sketches and whatnot. And he gives us an image of that area as utterly unchanged by progress in time, looking exactly the way it did when he was a kid. In the midst of the Industrial Revolution, no roads, like no paving, right? No railroads aren't really coming to the countryside yet. Right? Things go on as they always have. A ferry crosses the river. There's no bridge built there, right? To take the white horse to the other side. Cows grazing pleasantly by the side. The house in the background, the one with the red roof on the left, belonged to a farmer. It was a 16th century farmhouse. That in itself says something, right? A 16th century farmhouse. So it's 200 years old, 300 years old at this time. And the farmer who lived there, his name was Willie Lott, was 80 years old and had never left home for more than 4 days in his entire life. So for Constable, it's this metaphor for living in harmony with nature, not trying to control it, because that's an impossible task. But also where sort of time has stood still, where progress doesn't come. It's kind of a similar approach to the way Titian saw nature. When we looked at that, the musician out in the countryside with the shepherd, right? And the muses around them, right? That there's this something about going out to nature is getting away from the hubbub of the city, right? And that becomes part of this power of nature's theme as illustrated by our romantic artists. Now, as landscape painters, both Turner and Constable are making good money. Landscapes are relatively affordable as a kind of art. But in the eyes of the critics, landscapes were seen as kind of a lesser art that didn't require as much talent from the artist as history pictures did, right? So people like, or even event pictures, right? Things that required the human body in nature required more of the figure or more of the artist, right? And there was a sort of a hierarchy of categories of paintings, right? And at the very top were historical pictures, right? And at the very bottom were things like still lives and portraits. Still lives and landscapes. Even lower than that were portraits because the portrait artist could tell you what he wanted, right? A landscape painter at least has some freedom, you know. But a portrait said, I don't want to look like that, right? So, but those things were at the very bottom. But they made good money because they were affordable. Constable decides that he wants to try to convince people that landscapes are an important kind of art as well. And beginning right at this time, late 1810s, Constable sets out to do a whole series of monster huge landscapes, 6 feet across, right? Further across than I am tall, bigger than this slide on the screen, right? And there it is in situ. It's in New York, in the Frick collection, above that couch, right? Landscapes on a scale that landscapes had never been done before, right? And the idea for Constable is to make the landscape important as a kind of art, to elevate the status of the landscape painter by painting landscapes on a scale that was usually only seen for historical pictures. Pictures that big were always histories or portraits. He wants landscapes to be seen as important as any other kind of art. So he sets about making a series of 6-foot landscape paintings. Now this presents him some particular problems. Because if you're normally painting a landscape, and most landscapes are about like yay, right? 2.5, 3 feet across, maybe, right? When you're painting that big, there's a relationship between the things you're painting and the size of your brushes. You just think about it, right? You're going to paint trees, and you've got a series of brushes. The biggest one's probably like that wide, right? Maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches wide. But when you're painting a landscape that's 6 feet, you've got some problems that address you, right? That confront you in making this. How do you articulate things? How do you get to paint something that big? And what or what Constable did was he would go out to this area. He made sketches in sketchbooks. He made oil sketches. He's taking a limited number of paints. He's wrapping them up in pieces of pig's bladder, like what we put sausages in, right? And keep it moist for a day. Going out and making little sketches on paper outside of what cloud formations look like. Sketches of the area. Bring them back to the studio. Take all of these things and figure out the composition, right? And so what he'd do is he'd take these different studies. He'd make a regular size, normal size sketch, right? Just to figure out where everything goes, right? None of these are intended for anybody to see. These are not intended for display. They're studies leading up to the final work, right? But then, once he gets the composition figured out, how the fall of light is going to work, right, where the things are going to go, he then has this problem about how do you blow that up? How do I make that big, right? And what he would do is he'd square it off and paint each section larger, right? He then set about making full-sized sketches. So down at the National Gallery, we have the full-size sketch for the finished work, right? Blew it up, literally, to figure out sort of how I'm going to map this all out on a broad size level. And to think about that, to approach a 6-foot canvas with the idea that you're never going to display it. It's simply a study for the finished work. I can't imagine, right, asking any of our students to invest that way, right, in completing a 6-foot painting. And the whole point is that when he did it, he would figure out sort of how the light was going to fall on the water and how he was going to use the brush strokes to do that. And since it's a sketch, it's much more open, right? Much less finished, because it's just a sketch. He's just mapping things out. And then he sort of firms it up, if you will, in the final picture, right? So a full-size sketch for the finished picture. And that was part of the necessary process to move to this idea of a landscape that is literally as big as or bigger than many history pictures to raise its status. So again, the power of nature theme. I wanted to talk about 2 other images, 2 other landscapes in 2 other countries where we see this. This came from the Corcoran collection. It's part of the swag that the National Gallery got when the Corcoran closed, 3 years ago or so. And it's huge. It's almost 7.5 feet across, right? Even bigger than Constable's work by Frederick Church, working in the United States. And it, again, is very much about the power of nature, right? In this case, obviously, Niagara Falls, this extraordinary natural wonder in upstate New York, right on the Canadian border. And I have a nice detail of this, but as a romantic artist, he wants us to sort of be awed by the power of nature, and he puts us right on the edge of the falls in a sort of dangerous position where we are endangered by nature itself. The power of nature could sweep us over the edge. Right? Now, Church is part of a whole group of landscape artists in America that worked in New York City, but specialized in doing scenes from upstate New York that they would then sell in their studios in the cities. And many of them worked along the Hudson River. And so we refer to this group of artists as the Hudson River School. They're the sort of the most important, most prominent group of landscape painters in America in the early 19th century, the Hudson River School. And it's not a school like Marymount, right? It's not a building with walls. It's a school like fish, right, that swim together. It's a group of artists working in very similar ideas. And we're only going to look at Frederick Church, but there was a good dozen or so artists who we now call the Hudson River School. And their works coincide with westward expansion. America expanding out of the original 13 colonies, expanding westward through the course of the 19th century. And as we moved out of the cities, and as we began to discover America, we began to come across these extraordinary natural wonders. And they became very much the stuff of these pictures. And they represented to the people on the East what America was going to be all about, right? what was out there waiting for us, right? And as I said, he puts us right on the edge. And in this monster picture, 90 inches across, right? He paints with extraordinary detail, exacting detail. It's not like Turner, right? It's none of the sort of pushing the paint around to capture the force of nature itself. It really does do that, but it also illustrates. It's what nature looks like. And if you keep in mind how artists are painting in the 1850s, landscape artists, they are painting in the studio from sketches that they made on site. This is a fabrication of what water looks like. This is not sitting in front of it. He doesn't have photographs to work from. Photography's been invented, but it's not around a lot, right? Over and above that, quick photography, most photographs are very, very long exposures, right? He's creating this out of his head, out of sketches he's made, which I find absolutely extraordinary because it is so convincingly real. The way the light falls through the water, the way the water dances from the rapids, all coming from sketches he made in the out of doors. Right? So focusing very, very much on the power of nature, this ongoing romantic theme. For many people in America, the natural wonders like this, as we pushed our way west and saw the landscape get more and more extraordinary the further we pushed. This became a sign that this was the promised land. And we find essay writers talking about that America is the new promised land, that Americans, the settlers, are the new children of Israel, that we've fled Pharaoh, right? We've landed in the promised land, right, by fleeing England and coming here. All of it, of course, ignores any natives who might have been living here, right? That's not part of the narrative. But the idea is that America presents to us this land of wonder that is the land of promise and hope. And that's something of a theme that we saw with the Portrait of Washington, where as he's gesturing forward, stepping away from the throne, if you will, stepping away from the presidential chair, giving it up for someone else, turning his life to law. There's a rainbow behind his arm, the sign of promise, God's sign to Noah after the flood, that there would not be a flood that would kill us. People were struck when they saw Niagara Falls at the perpetual rainbow at Niagara Falls that church captures in the left-hand side of the picture. And people writing about Niagara Falls talked about it as a sign that this is the promised land, that this is America, we are the new pilgrims, and this is our land to take. Right? So this is picking up on a lot of ideas that are floating around at the time, the importance of the land for America's identity, right? In fact, that's a kind of a fascinating thing, right? Landscapes in America in the 19th century become very, very popular. And the only other time they've been anywhere near as popular as they were in America in the 19th century is really in Holland in the 17th century. And the historical situation is very much the same in both places. Holland was a new country. America was a new country. Holland had been reclaiming land from the sea. America is gaining land through westward expansion. Holland was primarily Protestant democracy. America, right? Very much the same. And at the same time that we have artists that are doing these sorts of paintings that extol the virtues of the land as a symbol of the country, we also have a number of Americans starting to collect paintings from the past. And one of the things that they seem to be very, very interested in is Dutch Baroque art. They love it. And I think one of the things they love about it is its realism. The extraordinary level of everyday realism that we find in artists like Vermeer, right, or Jacob van Ruysdael, the landscape painter. right? They love that stuff. And when they start to write about art, and especially about American art, they talk about realism as a particularly American trait. That it's in touch with the world around you. It's moral in a way because it's realistic. It doesn't try to be artificial. That it's rooted and grounded, and it reflects that realism reflects particularly American values. And that's, I think, impacting very strongly the way church approaches landscape. Right? All of these things coming together. Sort of interest in older Dutch art that's very realistic, affecting his attempts at realism. Very different approach than Turner right around the same time. The last romantic landscapes we'll look at are in Germany. You may have seen this before because it shows up like on record covers and things like that. It's such a famous image. In Germany, quite a few poets and writers were talking about nature and about the landscape. And in particular, when they wrote about it, they talked about looking at the landscape as a metaphor for the handiwork of God. And that by studying the landscape around us, one can come to a greater realization of the mysteries of heaven as reflected on earth. And we see a great number of images. Friedrich is easily the most important of these German landscape painters, where he sees a man looking out at this sort of dawn of creation kind of landscape. The mist rising up from the valley floor as he scaled this peak at the crack of dawn to look at it. Friedrich loves giving us figures seen from the back like this, figures who we project ourselves onto. We look at the landscape and imagine ourselves being this man standing on this dangerous precipice, right? Nature unspoiled by our works, nature unhurt by our presence, right? We're there simply to look. That's what Friedrich is really focusing on with this image. Right? The wonders of nature as metaphors for the handiwork of God. We have one of only two Friedrichs in America. It's downtown at the National Gallery. It's a relatively small landscape. It's only maybe 2 feet across or so. And you can tell probably from the crack pattern this way. A northern landscape in the spring. And again, he gives us figures seen from the back, not so prominently, but on the edge of this frozen lake, wandering around this apparently ice-bound tundra, going out for a little walk in order to, again, look at nature and try to understand life itself, try to understand the handiwork of God. And what Friedrich gives us is this really uninhabitable, uninviting landscape. My wife and I have been watching that Our Planet thing on Netflix that just came out with lots of places there about sort of nature as this unbearable, uninhabitable place sometimes, certainly for humans. And yet here they are in total harmony with nature, walking on the rocks on the edge of that frozen lake and looking all around them for nothingness almost. As if nature itself were utterly void of any other life form, except for these people who have wandered into it, who don't really belong there. It's a nature that's almost, in its way, dead and frozen. But one of the things Friedrich does here, and he does this a lot with his landscapes, is he gives us this idea that the landscape may look dead, may look frozen, but the landscape will come back. Nature will survive. And in the foreground, as we look through the snow, we begin to see that the snow is in fact abating. It's melting. And the grass is poking back through again. This is, again, a metaphor. Life goes on. Nature resurrects, right? Nature will persevere. It has the power to survive anything. Right? Something that we're becoming increasingly in doubt of anymore because we're doing so much more harm than anybody in the 19th century, it seems. Right? So Romanticism, we've seen sort of very dark images, sometimes very bleak images, sometimes very sublime, horrific images. but focusing on these areas of extreme freedoms, if you will, freedoms that come from insanity, freedoms that come from irrationality, freedoms that come from death itself, freedoms that come from the power of nature, being extolled through their works. And we ended up with a group of landscapes that deal with this exact same issue. So, as we're looking at Romanticism and Neoclassicism, I mentioned at the beginning of class, right, both of these movements come out of the Enlightenment, right? Enlightenment philosophy, which is really such an important development for the modern world, the Enlightenment, in that it really emphasized the degree to which the individual is important, right? The individual has an important role to play in society. That's an idea that didn't really exist in a broad scale in earlier times. And it changed very much the way we think about the world. It affects very much the way universities are run in America to this day. Right? That the individual is important, that the individual action has an impact. And what we see is that artists begin to approach works of art in a very different way. Works of art that have the potential to impact public opinion, rather than simply reflect the prominent ideas of the day. The artist has the opportunity to make a statement, to make a work of art that has a social agenda, social relevance. And whether it's Jericho's news story or David's history picture, both of them are making works of art with the idea that those people who see them might be swayed to think a particular way, and a particular way that benefits the good of the many, if you will. Right. This idea, this approach to art, leads to the next art movement of the 19th century. All of these art movements, Neoclassicism, Romanticism, and now Realism, are movements that were named by the artists themselves. They are not historians trying to classify things like we do with the Baroque and the Rococo. Right? These are artistically motivated movements. And the Realist movement begins on a particular date, 1848, the beginning of the Realist movement. And by realism, what they mean when they talk about realism as an art movement is not realistic. Right? We use realism to be looks like nature, right? A work of art that Church versus Turner, right, is realistic. But realism as a movement, which, by the way, Romanticism continues. They overlap, right? Realism as a movement, beginning in 1848, emphasized that what they mean by realism is images of the real world. And by images of the real world, what they mean is images of the world that don't normally get depicted. Everyday activities in the real world. So what they mean is not the world of political leaders, not the world of news events, but the world of the day-to-day. And that realism are these images of that reality, the reality of the daily world. Now, on Thursday, Khadijah was asking about Dutch genre. Isn't that what they were doing? Isn't that what Vermeer's doing as well? You got images of the daily world, or your ill-matched lovers, right? Images of the daily world, these genre scenes of the 16th and 17th century. Aren't those doing it as well? Well, yes and no. Right? Because the difference, the big difference, is, well, with Vermeer in particular, there's symbolism, there's meaning, but he's not trying to affect ideas about society. Your picture, right? The ill-matched lovers, the old icky guy with the teeth, right? And the young prostitute stealing his money. There's a moral lesson there about, hey, beware There are a lot of femme fatale images at that time, right? Images that demonize women. A pretty significant number of them in the early 16th century. And there's some sort of idea about they're making some statement about that, but they're not really trying to change people's ideas about what do we think about the broader community in the world and my place in it, right? There's a social agenda with 19th century realism that's not really there with 16th and 17th century genre pictures, right? So that would be the difference, right? The other difference is labor, right? We don't see that many pictures in genre pictures of hard labor. When we see people working, they're doing needlework, or they're playing the piano, right? Or they're having a drink. You know, they're often leisure time activities, or certainly not manual labor. So our woman holding a balance is getting ready to check the value of her jewels, right? Match size, whether it's the ill-matched lovers or the money changer and his wife, are just, they're going about their daily business. They're not engaged in hard labor. Courbet's figures, are engaged in hard labor, right? They're breaking rocks. And what they're doing is they're trying to level out an area so that a road can be put through, right? They're grading a road. So what that means is like when you have a road that's going to go over the top of a mountain, you want to try and carve it so that the rise isn't too steep, right? So that the carts can make it over more easily. We still do that, right? Take one of the highways west. Go up and take 80 west, right? And watch what happens when you go through the mountains. They've cut it down so that you can go through it more easily. And that's what the stonebreakers are doing by hand, right? And Courbet said that this is something he saw on a visit to the town where he grew up. We can actually identify where he is by the mountains in the background, right? And he goes back to the Paris studio and he tries to recreate what he had seen. Because it struck him, he said, as an image of utter misery. The ultimate human misery, represented by these stonebreakers. So if that's the case, if that's what he's trying to get across, this is an image of misery. How does he do it? How does he make this seem miserable rather than life-affirming? Right? Because sometimes hard labor can be a nice thing. You get something out of it, right? You feel better for having done it. I know I do because I sit in my desk all day. When I have to go out and do hard work, it's kind of a nice thing, right? How does Courbet make this miserable? What choices does he make as a painter that emphasize the misery of the figures? Help me out here. Yeah, Rena.
It kind of has this very, almost like a dark, it's not that it's the background, but it's this dark cloud.
Yeah, really dark cloud. The ominousness of that background, right? It's not only is it a dark cloud, but it also emphasizes that whatever that area that they're working in, we see the rocky bluff in the right corner, right? But that mountain must go up even higher over here off to the left, right? So where they're working is up in the mountains. This is not an easy task, right? So that definitely looms over them darkly, but also adds to the sort of the amount of labor involved. Yeah, were you raising your hand? Yeah, absolutely. Ripped clothes is key, right? Clothing is absolutely. What does he have? He has a little bit to deal with. It's not really a landscape painting, although the landscape is an important part of it, right? But there's the figures in their clothing, and look at, not only are they ripped, but they're repaired, right? So the figure on the right has got patches over his knees because he's simply worn them out. Ditto for the younger fellow on the left. He's got patches on his knees that have been sewn in. Tattered at the bottom, the vest and the shirt, right? So they're impoverished with this, and that makes them seem that much more miserable. Looking more at the figures, right? Notice that we can't see their faces, right? When we see figures' faces, it can certainly add a level of dignity to works, to how we feel about them as individuals. But in this case, they become sort of nameless workers, right? What else might you point to as things that sort of add to the misery of the image? Anything else?
I would say the skin of the
That's a really good point. He looks like he's been doing it for a really, really long time. His skin is just tan beyond tan, right? It's been it's like he's been tanned almost like leather, right? Both his hands and his chin have that sense of being totally tan, right? And he's been doing this forever. I think that's a really important part of the picture. I think that's exactly the underlying theme of the entire thing, is that this is a job you do forever, right? So what Courbet has done, not only by tanning the skin of the older man on the right, he gives us workers of very different ages, right? We have an older man, we don't know his age, right? He's probably younger than I am, but he's been out there for a long time. And then we have a kid next to him. So part of the message of this image is that the work only leads to more work. We have this idea, right? You guys are all in college for this idea, that your work can lead you to promotion, right? Can lead you somewhere else. But Courbet's image is an image that spreads the message that work doesn't lead out, right? Good work leads to the opportunity to continue doing it. And that's it, right? Marymount can be that way sometimes, right? You do good on a committee, you don't get out of committee work. You get put on another committee. And I've been on 4 committees every year for like the last 6 years because people want me on a committee. I should learn to suck at it, right? And then I wouldn't get on more committees. Still, hard work does pay off, right? Hard work gets you where you need to go. Not in this world. Right? Now we add to that some other elements about this, which I think were in the literature at the time, in the late 1840s. And that is the fact that they are working for the benefit of someone else. What they are doing is they are grading a road that they themselves will never use. This is a road that will bring inner city travel to this rural region, on the foothills of the Alps over here. That's where Courbet grew up, right? We are, this road will bring traffic in and out, will bring commerce and trade. How will that benefit these guys? Will they ever use the road that they're making? These were some of the arguments that were coming out in people that were writing about industry in the 1840s. Was the degree to which the Industrial Revolution and progress destroyed people who worked for their own profit and made people work for someone else's profit instead. Right? That under a cottage industry, under a pre-industrial age, when you worked, you saw the direct benefit of your work. You profited from what you made. But with industry and factories, right, workers now work for a paycheck, but the things that they produce profit someone else far greater. And this is part of the criticism that was leveled. And so the idea of our stone breakers leveling a road that they themselves will never ever use ties into this overall theme of industrialists getting richer and the people working for a paycheck not getting richer. Right? This was already there in the literature in the 1840s. And Courbet's tapping into that. So, Sherry, you were absolutely spot on by pointing to him as one of these extraordinarily impoverished figures, right? Working for the good of someone else, right? Working for the benefit of someone else. Even though he's being paid, yes, the true benefit of this road is not for him. And the boy with nothing more to look forward to other than eventually being hobbled like the man, down on your knees in the foreground. So all of these things add to this movement we call realism, focusing on everyday activities, often labor, with the idea that this is something you need to see. This is something artists need to address. This is a part of the world that we need maybe to think about. Is there an injustice going on here? Can the artists, through their works, highlight the injustices of the world? And that's where realism is coming from. Okay. Now, how did we get here? We looked at neoclassicism and romanticism, both of which had artists that were socially engaged. Right? But the realist movement also comes out of a very particular historical moment in 1848, which is the year we first see realist works at the Paris Salon. And I want to go back and trace a little bit more of French history in the 19th century to talk about how we got to realism. How did we wind up here? Right. So remember the revolution in 1789 inadvertently led us to having an emperor, Napoleon. Right? He was appointed by the revolutionaries as first consul back in 1799, came back from Italy to take that mantle, having been general of the French troops as they spread their colonization of the Mediterranean. We saw that here. He then crowns himself emperor, and for the next 10 years attempts to take over all of Europe, right? Invades Spain, right? Germany, Italy is already conquered, right? It's only the Brits who fight back and push him out of power at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Right? He's gone. Okay. This led to the Restoration monarchy, which we talked about before. For 15 years after Napoleon, France goes back to the old system of monarchy, kings by birthright, right? And what we saw during that period with Delacroix and with Géricault is that there were criticisms of the French monarchy, right? And there were pro-monarchy and anti-monarchy factions, very, very strong in France. This leads to a second revolution in 1830. I think this is the Les Mis Revolution, right? Is the second one, the July Revolution of 1830, against the monarchy, right? Against the Restoration monarchs. So this very famous image, which I'm sure you've seen before, it used to be on French money, right? Liberty leading the people, by Delacroix, celebrates the second revolution against the French monarchy. And we see a personification. That's not a fighter per se, that's the idea of liberty. Personified as a woman, leading people of all classes, from street urchins to bourgeoisie, to even non-Caucasians, right? In battle for the good of France, Notre Dame rising above the smoke in the background, right? A rallying cry around the idea of liberty. This accounts for the wardrobe malfunction, right? Liberty nourishes her followers, right? So we have a second revolution in 1830, okay? So France has gone in the last 50 years, 40 years, through a series of changes, from kings to revolutionaries to a consul to an emperor, back to kings again, right? Second revolution against the French kings, right? They decide at that point to implement a constitutional monarchy, a la Britain, where they'll have a king from that tradition, but the king's power will be checked by Parliament. The king cannot do anything unilaterally, right, without the approval of Parliament. So it's sort of British, it's sort of American, right? Our idea of the White House being checked by Congress, right? These ideas they'll put into place, and they elect King Louis Philippe as the new king of France, but his power will be checked by Parliament, which means, of course, that he can't act in the out-of-touch ways that other French kings had acted in the past. Right? Bold experiment in leadership, beginning in 1830. Well, Louis Philippe almost immediately begins to act unilaterally, circumventing Congress, if you will, circumventing Parliament. to do things his way. He begins to raise taxes on the poor, right? Milking the government to make the presidency, if you will, the monarchy richer, and gets extraordinarily vilified in the press for this. And the French press is on the rise in the 1830s, right? There are weeklies that are being published with new printmaking techniques, allowing for the publication of newspapers, journals, and these are filled with prints, images made by artists because they didn't have the technology yet to print photographs, right? And they are almost scandalous in the way that they mock Louis Philippe for his policies, right? And this one is one of the most famous. Daumier worked for 2 or 3 different newspapers in France in the 1830s, right? Sorry, I wanted to have that still up there. In the 1830s. And in this case, that's a portrait of the king. That's Louis Philippe. He had mutton chops on the sides of his face. And one time, Daumier drew him as a big pear, looking just like, because his face was kind of pear-shaped. Drew him as a pear and was sued for doing that. And he said, but, and he made this six-step drawing that went from a pear all the way to Louis Philippe. And he said, at which point am I doing something wrong here, right, along this set? Because this is a pear, and this is still a pear, and this is still a pear, and this is still a pear, right, and worked his way forward. In this case, he gives a pear-shaped head of Louis Philippe sitting on this massive throne as this giant, and he labels it Gargantua. Gargantua was a very, very famous 16th century novel, series of books by Rabelais, Francois Rabelais, who is to French literature what Shakespeare is to the Brits. It's like really up there in the sort of the pantheon of great French Renaissance authors. Right? These are 1530s, 1540s. And wrote a series of books about 2 giants who survived the flood of Noah by riding on top of the ark. And the novels are meant to be funny. They're full of scatological humor, lots of urination and defecation, right, going on throughout the entire thing. And they're meant to be satires of French society. And what Daumier does is he mines that well-known tradition to make Louis Philippe into Gargantua, a gluttonous giant who sits now on a royal throne. The throne is actually out of date. It's modeled after a 17th century throne. So he looks like the old French kings. And you can see what's happening is he's seated in front of the Senate. Behind him on the left, Paris off to the right, looking very much like the background of Delphi. And there we have the tax collectors in the lower right corner. And the impoverished of Paris are coming and giving them what little money they have. Right? Obviously, the message is that the taxes are hitting the poor more than they are the rich. These fat cats leaning there on their baskets, filling them with money, and as soon as the basket is full of cash, they'll carry it up to Gargantua, to Louis Philippe, and they will feed him the money. Right? And what Louis Philippe is doing is defecating out new positions, new parliamentary positions, prefect, nominations for the Parisian Law Council, various notes. So what he's doing is he's turning tax money, the money of the poor, into nothing more than bureaucratic proclamations, right? This interest in everyday life, this interest in the world around us that's coming out of newspapers is one of the things that feeds realism, right? And Daumier, in doing this, actually wound up having to spend 6 months in prison. The Louis Philippe had him locked up for libel for this picture. And from that point forward, Daumier continued to do politically based art, right? But had to be a lot more careful about it for fear of getting locked up again. Right? So this is one of the things that's now leading us toward realism. Not only do we have artists like Daumier who, through magazines and newspapers, are illustrating things that are going on, but we also have now Louis Philippe on the throne in 1630, right? And a new set of protests against him and his actions. We get a third revolution. So France eventually has three, right? The third revolution of 1848, where they would block off parts of the city with barricades to fight against the royal forces. Louis Philippe is deposed. And the French decide to go full American, a president with a term limit, right? A 4-year term limit, beginning in 1848. Now, the date on this is monumental. That is the same year that the realist movement began. Because part of what the new reigning government did was to institute a series of policies that were focusing on the working poor. The people who were laboring hard and not able to make ends meet. And the idea that a socially just society should make sure that if you are working a hard wage job that needs to be done, you should be paid enough to live in that society, right? That happens the same year the realism movement begins, which really focuses strongly on the working poor, on those people who are doing a necessary job, but at the same time are not adequately rewarded for it, right? So the policies that we see, feeding the hungry, paying the workers a living wage, are policies that are there when Courbet and other artists begin this new movement called realism. Right? And much of the focus is on the working class in the countryside. Right? So our history sort of informs our picture, right? Gives us an idea of what's going on at this time. We have a new government. Louis Philippe is out. We have new policies that are focusing increasing attention on those in society who have been underserved by that society. Right? And Courbet's pictures reflect this. Millet is also a realist artist, and also very much interested in this idea of art for social justice. The Gleaners, easily his most famous picture. Okay. He's moved to the area south of Paris, the old royal forest of Fontainebleau, where he can paint these rural scenes, the town of Barbizon. And he gives us this image of three gleaners. Have you heard the term gleaning before? Ever, in any context? Because we use it anymore for knowledge gaining. You glean something from something someone has said. You pick up on it. But the term gleaning was an old medieval term. It goes back to a feudal policy. So remember feudalism. We talked a little bit about it at the beginning of class, right? Under feudalism, the landlords had an agreement with the peasants who worked their land. And the agreement was that the peasants would work the land and the landlords would get everything, right? This is pre-capitalism. And in return, what the peasants got was protection, right? A roof over their heads, food, right? That was sort of the feudal arrangement. Profit went to the Lord. Okay? And there was no upward mobility. And a lot of people pointed to feudalism as they criticized what was going on in Paris in the 19th century. Right? One of the things under feudal practice that the landlord would do to feed, take care of his part of the deal without having to cut into his profit margin, is he said, okay, peasants, you can go out and re-pick the field that you've already picked. And whatever you get the second time around, you can keep it. Right, and eat it, right? And that way you don't have to give part of his profits to them, right? Evil, right? Whatever's left, you get to pay, and you can keep it. Okay? In the 19th century, And it was called gleaning the field, right? It was to go about and pick up the scraps that were left behind from the first harvest. Now, in the 19th century, with the new government that comes in 1848, right, as they're trying to do justice for the poor, as one of their primary platform items, they decide that definitely hunger in the countryside is a problem. So why don't we allow the peasants of the countryside to glean again? Now, we don't have landlords anymore, right? Feudal landlords. What we do have is industrial farms, right? Farms that are owned by individuals that are then worked by people who work for the farm owner. And that's what we have here is an industrial farm. You see the pit boss in the back on a horse? See all the houses behind it, these huge piles of grain. And in the foreground are 3 of the local women who've been allowed to come back and glean the field. Right? This is new government policy. We feed them by reinstituting this. What do you think Millet thinks about that? Is this going to work? Why not, sorry? Well, how does he tell us it's not going to work? What's the visual? It's not going to work, yeah. Is there anything there in the image that tells us that?
It's just really it's not enough to feed the poor.
It's about plenty versus not, right? I mean, the background there's so much there, right? In the background, but there's so little in their hands, right? If each one of them presumably represents a family, right? Then are they getting anywhere near, even though the one in the middle has a fairly full bag, right? Is there any way that they're getting enough to feed 3 families here? Or will they? Right? And since they're not the ones that are picking the field the first time around anyway, they can't sort of fake it, do a bad job and do stuff like that so that they have more. Other people have cleaned it and they've been paid to clean it well, right? So Millet, I think, is very much criticizing the idea, right? All we have left on the ground are just the roots. You can see them coming up, right? And he juxtaposes these 3 women out looking for what little they can find with these mountains of grain in the background, with figures moving around with huge bales of it and making these huge haystacks, and then the cart here with the figure riding on top of it. So it totally is about the idea of plenty versus want, right? At the same time, one of the things that Millet does is even though they're impoverished, and even though it really is kind of pitiful, this policy, he still gives them a certain sense of dignity. Even though we don't see their faces, they're so monumental against the background. There's something they're finding some sort of dignity in what they're doing, and that's something that Millet brings to all of his peasant workers as he depicts them. They may be downtrodden, but they still have a sort of sense of inner dignity that comes from this sort of stature that they have in the countryside. We've got a couple of Millets up in Baltimore. We have one down here in D.C. It's not a working scene, but we have a few of these up in Baltimore where we can see how Millet has brought very much the same idea of dignifying the hard work of the rural working class around this area of Barbizon where he's living, dignifying those activities. Our last image for the day, Rosa Bonheur. We haven't seen too many women artists, but here we have another. Also works in the Barbizon region and then moves back to Paris and gives us again an image of the dignity of rural work, the strength and dignity of it. In this case, whereas Millet shows us the people who are left aside, who are outcast by new farming techniques, and thus starving from the very process. What Bonheur shows us is a self-sufficient farmer, one who benefits from his own work, the ideal that's been lost, if you will, rather than the reality of what currently exists. Now she's working here primarily in Paris. She's moved back from the Barbizon region and is now working in Paris. And she's going to be primarily a painter of these rural scenes, right? And she depicts for us the farmer with his cows, very realistically drawn. Rosa Bonheur, in order to study anatomy, both of animals and humans, would go to slaughterhouses for the animals. And the annual or the weekly horse fair in Paris, and make sketches from life. But because the horse fair was forbidden for women to go to, she had to dress up like a man in order to actually make the drawings. And I want to point to that simply because 10 weeks into class, 12 weeks into class, how many women artists have we seen? Number 3? Right? There was this article that came out in the early 70s, early part of the feminist movement, about sort of simply titled, "Why Are There No Great Women Artists?" Written by Linda Nochlin, who passed away last year. And her point was that there weren't because of things like this. How do you study animal anatomy and get it right for your paintings if you're not even allowed to go to the freaking horse fair? Right? As someone who's witnessing, when a man could go and sit there and have a glass of beer or wine and watch this all he wanted to. Rosa Bonheur had to dress up, right? Had to cross-dress in order to attend the horse fair so that she could practice her art. And it was just one of a number of impediments that existed for women artists. Right? I don't even like using the term women artists. It makes it sound like if I don't say women, then artist means man. You know? But women who wanted to be artists simply encountered a vast number of hurdles that men behind them simply did not. Right? So our plowing scene benefits from her study of anatomies that she made on site at horse fairs and for the animals studying musculature in the slaughterhouse. And we can see she really gets it right. She's a terrific animal painter, right? And there, in fact, up at the Met in New York, there's a 20-foot painting of the horse fair there as well. So what we've seen now with realist artists, right, so far the 3 that we've looked at, is this interest in the working poor. And that interest coincides with a sort of, I don't want to say nationwide, but a broader social interest in the working poor that we see coming out of the new government in 1848, after the Third Revolution, right? We'll look at 1 or 2 more realist artists in a week when I see you next. And that will push us directly into the Impressionists, because that grows directly out of this movement. So, have a good Easter break, and I'll see you a week from tomorrow on Tuesday.